Well, this is an introduction to the Bible, or the good book. And to talk about the Bible, we first have to realize that the Bible is an essential book in the history of the West. Absolutely essential. We call it the good book or just the book. That's where the word Bible comes from. It's Latin. But it means just the book because of its prominence and its importance. And to talk about or to introduce it, we have to start by talking about why it is so valuable. And then in order to make sense of it, we also have to talk about why it's so complicated. So that's what we're going to do for this first introduction. So let's start by talking about how important the Bible is. Christianity depends entirely on the Bible, and it has from the very beginning. Early Christians, as they came out of Judaism and as they established this new religion, they began to write, and these writings became the sacred writings for Christianity. But they were encouraged to write, and they were inspired to write because the Hebrew people before them had done the same thing. They had inherited this Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament as we refer to it in the Bible, and so the New Testament, these Christian writings, the Old Testament, the Hebrew writings, they worked together and they became authoritative for the church. So that when we start going back and we think about the church, we look back at old artwork, what we start to see is that Scripture is valuable because people are using it, especially guys like this. This is St. Augustine. And what's the picture of Augustine having it? Granted, he's got all these weird robes on and a funny looking hat, but more important, what's in his hand? Well, there's a staff, yes. But more importantly, there's a Bible. Why? Because part of his job, in fact, one of the fundamental roles of the job of the clergy or the leaders of the church was to teach the Bible. And so Augustine was known for doing just this. And for centuries, this was the work of the clergy. They'd read the book, they would study it, they would pass it on and share it with the people who would come and share in the Christian religion. So the Bible was always important historically. Now it becomes more important with our buddy Martin Luther. Luther shows up on the scene, and he's got a lot of religious angst. And as he's kind of working through this religious angst, he becomes a student of Scripture and then a professor teaching about Scripture. And while he's in one of these crazy places in his life, he has what he calls his tower experience. And he was feeling exceptionally anxious, and he was there in his study, which was in that tower that you see there. And he has this vision or this realization as he is reading Scripture that righteousness is a gift from God and is received by faith alone. He's reading Romans when this happens. Voila. At this point, Scripture becomes absolutely essential to Luther and more authoritative than the Pope. He also realizes that it's more authoritative than the emperor. That's a pretty big thing to do. So he ends up having to stand before the emperor. He's called to account for these horrible things he's saying. And he says, look, if you can prove through Scripture that you're right and I'm wrong, I'll listen to you. But Scripture is a higher authority than you are. That's a pretty blatant statement. It's not well received, but Luther sticks to his guns on this one. And so the Reformation begins. But not long after this, Luther, who wants to put the Bible into everybody's hands, makes a copy in German. He translates it into German. And this is really the beginning of the Bible craze that has taken over the last 500 years. We are obsessed with the Bible because Luther put it into the common language and everybody's been trying to read it ever since. So from the very beginning, it's valuable because it's so tied to our history. But it's also valuable because Scripture is the rule of life. That is, it is supposed to give us guidance in the way that we live. There are many places in Scripture where we see this to be the case. There's the Ten Commandments, which as confirmation students you're going to spend a lot of time with. But then there's the Golden Rule that Jesus says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. There's the law of Moses and these directions for these ancient societies. There's warnings and prophecies and the idea that change or bad things will happen to you. There's wisdom literature. There's many times there's instructions given to young men and women or conversations about what it means to live a wise life. There's the life of Christ, which is meant to be a model for us to follow. There's Christ's Sermon on the Mount, where he takes the Ten Commandments, he reinterprets them, he enlarges them, and he says, look, we all need to follow them. This is supposed to be what we do with our life. And then there's St. Paul with the fruit of the Spirit, where he talks about what is a Christian supposed to look like? How are they supposed to live? Well, kindness and benevolence and self-discipline and love, these are supposed to be the characteristics of the Christian. So the Bible has always been a rule of life. This is what makes it valuable. But not only is it historically important, not only is it a rule of life, it also so happens that in order to understand culture, one has to understand Scripture. And whether the culture you prefer is Mozart or whether it's the Hunger Games, an understanding of Scripture goes a long way in shaping the way that we understand contemporary culture, contemporary life, and contemporary art. So, Scripture is valuable. That being said, Scripture is also complicated. In fact, it's really complicated. Let me explain. Scripture was written over the course of 2,000 years by hundreds of authors. Now, some of these authors never wrote a word down. Jesus, for instance, never wrote anything, but people wrote down his words. So you have hundreds of authors, lots of characters, and all kinds of events that go on. It's also written in 3 languages. There's Hebrew, there's Aramaic, and there's Greek. So you have a vastly complicated book from the very beginning. When you add this to the fact that there's also a gazillion other pieces of literature out there on these same themes, what we get is a donut. And what's in the donut is that the scripture we have is like the center of that donut ring. And all these other writings that were taking place at the same time surround it. And so there's scripture, and then there's all kinds of other material that surrounds it. Well, one has to understand some of this material to make sense of Scripture. So that adds a certain level of complexity. It also explains why we have what we call the canon. Now, the canon is not really a thing that shoots cannonballs, but it is a canon like a canon of literature or of film. If you ever wanted to study film or art, you can't possibly ingest every movie that's ever been made. You have to start by watching the select important movies. So this is essential to understanding film. When it comes to Scripture, it's the same thing. There's a selection of the important stuff. That's the center of the donut. So there is a canon of Scripture. However, one has to understand beyond that as well. Add this to the fact that Scripture's been translated a gazillion times. In fact, it's been translated at least 250 times into English alone. So that means if you go to Barnes & Noble and you're like, oh, I'll buy a Bible. Who knows what translation you're going to end up with? And not only are there translations, but there's a mass variety of copies and flavors to these translations, so it's nothing but a headache to wade through. Truthfully, when we think about Scripture, we have to think of it more as an encyclopedia and less as a novel. And what I mean by that is that it is a collection of works, and it is massive to try to get our head around. And it involves thousands of years of scholarship and thought and wisdom being poured into it. It is not like reading Harry Potter. They too have nothing in common. It's like reading the Encyclopedia Britannica. Needless to say, it's complicated. But that is no excuse because it is so valuable. Scripture is incredibly valuable to history, to culture, to our life and how we are supposed to live, that it is worth navigating the complexity and figuring out what all it means. And that's what we're going to do in the next few videos.